I knew trouble was brewing the moment I saw Patricia Wellington marching across my front lawn with that signature scowl on her face. Her blonde bob haircut bounced with each determined step. One manicured finger already pointed accusingly at me as I stood watering my beloved cherry trees in the early May sunshine. "Ryan Nielsen," she barked, her voice carrying across the entire cul-de-sac. "Those trees are not on the approved landscaping list." I sighed and set down my garden hose. This was far from our first confrontation since I'd moved into Oakridge Estates 6 months ago. Patricia was the president of our homeowners association, a position she wielded like a medieval tyrant with a clipboard instead of a sword. "Good morning to you too, Patricia," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "These cherry trees have been here for 3 years. They were planted by the previous owners and approved by the previous HOA board." Patricia's thin lips pressed together into an even thinner line. "Well, the board has new standards now. Those fruit trees are unsightly and attract pests. The committee voted last night. You have 2 weeks to remove them." I felt my blood pressure rising. The cherry trees were one of the main reasons I'd fallen in love with this house. They framed my property beautifully, provided welcome shade during the scorching Nevada summers, and produced the most delicious cherries I'd ever tasted. "I'm not removing my trees, Patricia. They're healthy, maintained, and were grandfathered in when I bought the house. It's right there in my purchase documents." She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures. "We'll see about that. You'll be receiving a formal notice by tomorrow. The fines start at $100 per day if you don't comply." As she strutted away, I noticed my neighbor Ted peering over the fence with a sympathetic look. Once Patricia was out of earshot, he shook his head. "She's on the warpath today," he called over. "Just got done telling the Johnsons their basketball hoop needs to be painted desert sandstone instead of white. Apparently, white is too visually disruptive." I laughed despite my frustration. "What does that even mean?" "Who knows?" Ted shrugged. "But I'd watch those trees if I were you." Patricia doesn't make idle threats. I didn't take Ted's warning seriously enough. Looking back, that was my first mistake. The formal notice arrived in my mailbox the next day, printed on the HOA's official letterhead. I immediately dug out my purchase documents, and, sure enough, there was a specific clause stating that existing landscaping was approved and grandfathered in for new owners. I wrote a polite but firm response, attached copies of the relevant documents, and dropped it in Patricia's mailbox that evening. 3 days later, I received another notice, this time threatening immediate legal action and claiming my documentation was irrelevant to current standards. The fine had also mysteriously increased to $200 per day. I decided it was time to attend an HOA meeting in person. The following Tuesday, I walked into the community center conference room, surprised to find it packed with other disgruntled homeowners. Apparently, I wasn't the only one dealing with Patricia's sudden campaign of enforcement. "Next item," Patricia announced from her position at the head of the table, barely glancing at me as I found an empty chair. "Landscape violations at 742 Oakridge Drive." That was my address. I straightened up, waiting for my chance to speak. "The homeowner has been notified of fruit tree violations and has refused to comply," Patricia continued, shuffling through her papers. "I move that we proceed with enforcement actions." "I'd like to speak," I said, raising my hand. Several heads turned in my direction. Patricia pursed her lips. "Homeowners have a 2-minute comment period at the end of the meeting." "But you're discussing my property right now," I pointed out. "And I have documentation that proves my trees were approved by the previous board." An older gentleman at the end of the table, the nameplate in front of him read Walter Green, treasurer, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should hear what Mr. Nielsen has to say, Patricia. If there's existing documentation, we should review it." Patricia's nostrils flared, but she reluctantly nodded. 2 minutes. I presented my case clearly and concisely, showing the documents that proved my trees were exempt from the new rules. Several board members nodded along, and I started to feel hopeful. Then Patricia spoke up. "These trees are attracting pests and creating a nuisance. We've had multiple complaints." "From whom?" I challenged. "That information is confidential," she snapped. Walter peered at her over his reading glasses. "I don't recall any formal complaints being submitted about Mr. Nielsen's trees, Patricia." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Patricia shuffled her papers again, avoiding Walter's gaze. "Well, I've observed fruit falling and rotting. It's unsightly." "I clean up any fallen fruit daily," I countered, "and I've never received a citation for yard maintenance." The meeting ended with no clear resolution. The board decided to table the issue pending further review, which felt like a small victory. As I was leaving, Walter approached me. "Keep an eye on those trees, son," he said quietly. "Patricia's been on some kind of crusade lately. Between you and me, I think it has something to do with her being passed over for the City Beautification Committee last month." I thanked him for the advice and headed home, feeling uneasy but hoping the matter was resolved, at least temporarily. The next week was quiet. Too quiet in retrospect. I should have been suspicious when the threatening letters suddenly stopped. Instead, I foolishly believed that reason had prevailed. On Saturday morning, I left early to visit my brother across town. We spent the day helping him install new flooring in his basement, and I didn't return home until after sunset. As I pulled into my driveway, something felt wrong. The silhouette of my house looked different, somehow more exposed. It wasn't until I stepped out of my car and flipped on the porch light that I realized what had happened. My cherry trees, all 4 of them, were gone. Not just trimmed or damaged, but completely removed, right down to the stumps. Small piles of sawdust were the only evidence they had ever existed. I stood there in shock, unable to process what I was seeing. Those trees had been at least 15 years old, healthy and thriving. Now they were just gone. A motion sensor light clicked on next door, and I saw Ted hurrying over, still wearing his dinner napkin tucked into his collar. "I tried to stop them," he said breathlessly. "They showed up with a truck and equipment around noon, said they had permission from the HOA to remove nuisance trees." "Who did?" I demanded, my shock turning to fury. "Some landscaping company. I asked to see paperwork, but they just showed me an HOA work order with Patricia's signature. I called her, but she didn't pick up." By the time I thought to start recording, they'd already taken down 2 trees and were working on the 3rd. Ted pulled out his phone and showed me a video. Sure enough, there was a truck with Green Valley Landscaping painted on the side, and 3 workers efficiently cutting down what remained of my cherry trees. "I'm so sorry, Ryan," Ted said. "I should have done more." "It's not your fault," I assured him, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Did they say where they took the trees?" Ted shook his head. "They loaded everything into their chipper." The realization that my trees were now mulch hit me like a punch to the gut. I thanked Ted and went inside, too angry to trust myself speaking to anyone else that night. I barely slept. By morning, my shock had crystallized into determination. I spent Sunday gathering evidence, taking photos of the stumps, collecting Ted's video, finding before pictures of the trees, and digging up every document related to my property and the HOA rules. On Monday morning, I called in sick to work and made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Green Valley Landscaping. where an apologetic office manager confirmed they had been hired by Patricia Wellington, personally, not the HOA as an organization, to remove nuisance trees from my property. She emailed me a copy of the work order, which Patricia had signed with her name and HOA president underneath, clearly implying official HOA action. My second call was to a lawyer named Elizabeth Cassidy, who specialized in property disputes and HOA issues. She agreed to see me that afternoon. Elizabeth's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her mid-30s, but her handshake was firm and her eyes sharp as she reviewed the documents I'd brought. "This is outrageous," she said finally, setting down my folder. She had absolutely no authority to do this. Even if the trees violated HOA rules, which they clearly didn't based on your grandfathering clause, there's a legal process they must follow. They can't just show up and remove your property. "So what can I do?" I asked. Elizabeth leaned forward. "You have several options. We could file a complaint with the HOA board, but given that Patricia is the president, that might not get far. We could report this to the police as destruction of property, though they often view HOA disputes as civil matters." She tapped her pen against her desk thoughtfully. "The most effective route would be to sue both Patricia personally and the HOA for the value of the trees, trespass, and emotional distress." "How much could that be worth?" I asked. Mature fruit trees are surprisingly valuable. Their replacement cost is high, and established trees that are already producing fruit are worth even more. Plus, there are potential treble damages under Nevada law for willful destruction of trees. We'd need an arborist to give us an official valuation, but based on what you've described, we could be looking at $35,000 to $40,000 in damages, possibly more. The figure startled me. "That much," Elizabeth nodded. "People underestimate the value of established landscaping. Those trees would cost thousands each to replace with mature specimens, and even then, it would take years for them to produce fruit at the level your established trees did, not to mention the aesthetic value and the emotional attachment." I sat back, processing this information. "Let's do it." "I should warn you," Elizabeth said, "these cases can get ugly. HOAs often have legal funds set aside for disputes, and they can drag things out. Are you prepared for that?" "Those trees were important to me," I said firmly. "And what Patricia did was wrong. If I don't stand up to her now, who knows what she'll do next to me or someone else in the neighborhood." Elizabeth smiled. "That's the spirit. Let's get started." Over the next week, we built our case. Elizabeth arranged for a certified arborist to examine the stumps and provide a professional valuation. Based on the age, species, health, and fruit-bearing capability of the trees, he valued them at $42,500 total. With his report in hand, Elizabeth filed a lawsuit against both Patricia personally and the HOA for $40,000 in damages, plus legal fees. The day Patricia was served with the lawsuit papers, I happened to be working in my front yard. I'll never forget the look of shock on her face as she stood on her porch, reading the documents. She stormed across the street, waving the papers wildly. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her face flushed with anger. "It's pretty self-explanatory, Patricia," I replied calmly. "You illegally destroyed my property. Now you're being held accountable." "I was enforcing HOA rules. You were in violation." "No, I wasn't. And even if I had been, you had no legal right to enter my property and remove my trees without due process. You acted on your own, not with board approval." Her face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this. The HOA has attorneys on retainer who will eat your little lawsuit for breakfast." "We'll see," I said, turning back to my gardening. Have a nice day." Patricia stalked off, already on her phone, presumably calling those attorneys she was so confident about. 2 days later, I received a call from Elizabeth. "The HOA's attorney reached out to me," she said. "They're claiming the HOA had no knowledge of Patricia's actions and that she acted entirely on her own. They're distancing themselves from her." I couldn't help but laugh. Throwing her under the bus already, it seems so. "They've offered to settle the HOA portion of the suit for $15,000 if we drop them from the case and proceed only against Patricia personally." I thought about it. "What do you advise?" "It's a decent offer from the HOA," Elizabeth said. "They clearly want to wash their hands of this mess. However, we have a strong case against both parties. The HOA is ultimately responsible for the actions of its officers, especially when those actions were taken under color of HOA authority. In the end, we decided to counter with $25,000 from the HOA, with the remainder to be sought from Patricia." The HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. I attended that meeting along with about 30 other homeowners, all curious about the lawsuit that was now the talk of the neighborhood. Patricia was conspicuously absent. Walter Green, now acting as interim president, called the meeting to order. "As many of you have heard, our HOA is facing a lawsuit regarding the unauthorized removal of trees from a homeowner's property. The board has thoroughly investigated this matter and determined that our former president, Patricia Wellington, acted without board approval or knowledge." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Former president, Miss Wellington tendered her resignation yesterday," Walter continued. "The board has accepted it, effective immediately. We are now discussing settlement options for this unfortunate situation." The meeting was tense but productive. Several homeowners spoke up about their own run-ins with Patricia's overzealous enforcement. By the end, the board voted to accept our settlement offer, with the stipulation that I would help draft clearer rules about landscaping changes and enforcement procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. As the meeting was breaking up, Walter approached me. "I owe you an apology," he said, shaking my hand. "The board should have been more diligent in overseeing Patricia's actions. Things had gotten out of hand." "I appreciate that," I said. "What happens now with the lawsuit against Patricia?" "That's between you and her," Walter replied. But off the record, the board reviewed our records and found several other instances where she may have overstepped her authority. You might not be the only one with grounds for a complaint." The HOA paid the agreed $25,000 within 2 weeks. The case against Patricia, however, proved more challenging. She hired her own attorney who tried every delay tactic in the book. First, she claimed she had acted within her rights as HOA president. When that argument faltered, she tried to argue that the trees were diseased and posed a hazard, contradicted by the arborist's report. Finally, she claimed financial hardship and inability to pay. 3 months after filing the lawsuit, we found ourselves in mediation. Patricia looked nothing like the confident tyrant who had stormed across my lawn that first day. Her hair was unstyled, her expression drawn. "My client is prepared to offer $5,000 to settle this matter," her attorney began. Elizabeth shook her head. "That's not even close to the value of the destroyed trees. We have an expert valuation of $42,500. Miss Wellington is not in a position to pay that amount," her attorney argued. "Then perhaps she should have considered that before destroying valuable property," Elizabeth replied crisply. The mediation dragged on for hours. By the end, we had reached a settlement. Patricia would pay me $15,000, with payments spread over 2 years, and issue a formal written apology that would be shared with all Oakridge Estates residents. It wasn't the full amount, but Elizabeth advised me it was a reasonable outcome given the circumstances. More importantly, it sent a message that would resonate throughout the community. The first installment of Patricia's payment arrived a month later, along with her written apology. It was clearly drafted by her attorney, stiff and formal, but it acknowledged her wrongdoing and overreach of authority. Meanwhile, life in Oakridge Estates began to change. Walter Green was elected the new HOA president, and the board adopted the clearer guidelines we had drafted together. Regular town halls were instituted where residents could voice concerns and suggestions. As for my yard, I used part of the settlement money to plant new trees, 2 apple trees, a peach, and a plum. They were young saplings, nowhere near the size of my lost cherry trees, but they represented a fresh start. I also installed a security camera system covering my property, just in case. Patricia eventually moved away, selling her house just before the winter holidays. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd relocated to a condominium with no HOA. Perhaps she'd learned her lesson about the limits of authority. One evening the following spring, as I was tending to my new fruit trees, Ted called over the fence. "Those new trees are coming along nicely," he observed. "They are," I agreed. "It'll be a few years before they bear fruit, but they're healthy." "You know," Ted said thoughtfully, "what happened was terrible, but it ended up changing things for the better around here. The HOA actually works for the homeowners now, instead of against us." I nodded, looking around at the peaceful neighborhood. Children were playing in yards, neighbors were chatting on porches, and there wasn't a clipboard-wielding tyrant in sight. "Sometimes," I replied, "you have to stand your ground to make change happen." "Well, I'm glad you did," Ted said. "We all are." As the sun set over Oakridge Estates, I felt a sense of satisfaction. My cherry trees were gone, but in their place had grown something perhaps even more valuable: a community where people respected each other's rights and property. It had been an expensive lesson for Patricia, but a necessary one for us all. The following summer brought unexpected developments. While my new fruit trees were still too young to bear fruit, the settlement money had allowed me to transform my yard into a garden oasis that complied fully with the new, more reasonable HOA guidelines. I'd even been invited to join the landscape committee, which now focused on sustainability and native planting recommendations rather than rigid enforcement. One Saturday morning, as I was installing a new drip irrigation system for my garden, a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. To my surprise, an elderly woman emerged, looking tentatively at my house. "Can I help you?" I called, setting down my tools. She approached slowly, using a cane for support. "You must be Ryan Nielsen. I'm Margaret Wellington, Patricia's mother." I tensed immediately. Was this some kind of ambush? A year had passed since the lawsuit settlement, but the memory was still fresh. "Don't worry," Margaret said, noting my expression. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Quite the opposite, actually." I invited her to sit on my porch, offering her a glass of iced tea, which she gratefully accepted. "I wanted to apologize in person for what my daughter did," Margaret said after taking a sip. "Patricia has issues with control that go back to her childhood. Her father and I probably didn't help matters. We were very strict." "I appreciate the apology," I said, unsure where this conversation was heading. Margaret set down her glass. "There's more. Patricia was diagnosed with some mental health issues after what happened here. The stress of the lawsuit forced her to finally seek help. She's been in therapy for the past year." I wasn't sure how to respond. While I was glad Patricia was getting help, it didn't change what she had done. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Margaret continued, seeming to read my thoughts. What she did was wrong, regardless of her issues. But I wanted you to know that some good came of it. She's working on herself now. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is the final payment she owes you. She wanted to pay it off early as part of her, making amends, I suppose. Her therapist suggested it might help her move forward. I accepted the envelope, somewhat stunned by this turn of events. Thank you for bringing this. There's one more thing, Margaret said hesitantly. Patricia planted some cherry trees at her new place. She said they remind her to think before she acts. Isn't that something? After Margaret left, I sat on my porch for a long time, reflecting on the strange ways life unfolds. The trees I had lost had changed not just our community, but apparently Patricia herself. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Elizabeth, my lawyer. She had been contacted by homeowners from Sunnyvale Estates, another HOA-governed community across town. They were dealing with an overreaching board president who had been issuing excessive fines and making arbitrary rule changes. They heard about your case, Elizabeth wrote. They're wondering if you'd be willing to speak with them about your experience and how you successfully challenged your HOA. I replied immediately, offering to meet with them. Perhaps my painful experience could help others stand up for their rights too. The meeting with the Sunnyvale homeowners took place the following week at a local coffee shop. There were 5 of them, all looking stressed and frustrated expressions I recognized all too well. Our HOA president, Karen Mitchell, has gone power mad, explained Robert, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair. She's fining people for ridiculous things, having a bird feeder that's the wrong shade of brown, grass that's half an inch too tall, you name it. Last month, she had my rose bushes removed while I was on vacation, added Maria, an elderly woman who dabbed at her eyes as she spoke. Said they were non-compliant varieties. They were award-winning heirloom roses my late husband and I had cultivated for 20 years. Their stories continued, each one more outrageous than the last. It seemed this Karen was cut from the same cloth as Patricia, perhaps even worse. The thing is, I told them after listening carefully, HOAs do have certain legal powers, but they're not unlimited. There are procedures they must follow, and they can't just destroy your property without due process. I shared my experience, walking them through the steps I had taken with Elizabeth's guidance. By the end of our 3-hour meeting, they had a clear action plan and renewed determination. Thank you, Maria said, squeezing my hand as we parted. You've given us hope. Sometimes it feels like these HOA tyrants are invincible, but you've shown us they're not. Over the next few months, I found myself becoming something of an informal consultant for homeowners dealing with HOA overreach. Elizabeth occasionally referred people to me, and I would share my experience and offer moral support as they navigated their own challenges. It wasn't a role I had ever expected to fill, but it was deeply satisfying to help others stand up for themselves. Meanwhile, Oakridge Estates continued to flourish under its new leadership. Walter Green had instituted quarterly community gatherings that were part business meeting, part social event. Neighbors who had previously only interacted when reporting rule violations to the HOA were now forming friendships and community initiatives. One such initiative was a neighborhood orchard and community garden on a previously unused common area. The irony wasn't lost on me. The community that had once persecuted a homeowner for having fruit trees was now collectively growing them. I volunteered to help plan and maintain the orchard, sharing what I had learned about fruit tree care from my research after losing my cherry trees. We planted a variety of fruit trees, including 4 cherry trees that I donated in memory of the ones I had lost. During one community planting day, I found myself working alongside Derek, the landscaper who had removed my trees on Patricia's orders. He had been hired by our new HOA for legitimate maintenance work and was clearly uncomfortable when he recognized me. "I'm really sorry about what happened," he said awkwardly as we prepared soil for planting. "I should have verified the work order more carefully." When someone presents themselves as an HOA official, you tend to just take their word for it. "Water under the bridge," I assured him, though it had taken time to reach that point of forgiveness. "We all learned something from that situation." "My company has new protocols now," Derek said. "We require board approval documentation for any removal work, not just a single signature. Your case changed how we do business." As we worked side by side planting cherry trees in the community orchard, I felt a sense of closure that no legal settlement could have provided. My personal loss had sparked changes that rippled outward, affecting not just our HOA but other communities and businesses as well. That fall, I received a surprising phone call from Maria at Sunnyvale Estates. "We did it," she exclaimed, her voice jubilant. Karen resigned from the board after we presented evidence that she had violated both HOA bylaws and state law. "The new board has already voted to revise the rules and restore my rose garden." "That's wonderful news," I said, genuinely happy for her. "It wouldn't have happened without your guidance," Maria continued. "We used your case as a blueprint. When Karen realized we were serious about legal action, she backed down rather quickly. Similar calls and emails came in from others I had advised. Not every case ended in litigation. Sometimes just the threat of legal action was enough to bring about change. Each success story reinforced what I had learned. Standing up to bullies, whether in elementary school playgrounds or suburban HOAs, was sometimes necessary to create lasting change. 2 years after the tree incident, my new fruit trees began producing their first small harvests. I shared the fruits with neighbors and used some to make pies for our community gatherings. The young cherry trees in the community orchard were thriving as well, their spring blossoms attracting admirers from throughout the neighborhood. At one such gathering, Walter approached me with a proposal. "The board has been discussing creating a handbook for other HOAs about balancing enforcement with homeowner rights," he explained. "We were hoping you might contribute a section based on your experience." I agreed readily. The handbook project expanded to include input from lawyers, real estate professionals, and homeowners with various HOA experiences. When it was completed, copies were distributed to HOAs across the state and made available online for communities nationwide. Around this time, Elizabeth called me with news about Patricia. "She started a support group for people with control issues," she told me. "Apparently, her therapy has been quite transformative. She's using her experience as a cautionary tale." I found it hard to reconcile this information with the Patricia I had known, but people can change when forced to confront the consequences of their actions. I wished her well in her journey, though I had no desire to reconnect personally. 3 years after losing my original cherry trees, I received an invitation to speak at a state conference on HOA governance. The event brought together HOA board members, property managers, and homeowners to discuss best practices and legal considerations. My presentation, titled "When Enforcement Goes Too Far: A Homeowner's Perspective," drew a standing room-only crowd. I shared my story without embellishment, focusing on the lessons learned and how communities could balance rule enforcement with respect for homeowner rights. After my talk, a man approached me. He introduced himself as a state legislator who was working on a bill to reform HOA regulations. Your story perfectly illustrates why we need clearer laws about HOA power limits, he said. Would you be willing to testify at a committee hearing next month? Personal experiences like yours help legislators understand the real-world impact of these issues. I agreed without hesitation. The opportunity to help shape policy that might prevent others from experiencing what I had gone through was too important to pass up. The legislative hearing was intimidating, a formal room filled with lawmakers, lobbyists, and media. But when it was my turn to speak, I found the words came easily. I described not just the loss of my trees and the legal battle that followed, but also the positive changes that had come about in our community as a result. HOAs serve an important purpose in maintaining community standards, I concluded. But without proper checks and balances, they can become vehicles for individual agendas and petty tyranny. Homeowners need legal protections and clear avenues for redress when HOA powers are abused. My testimony, along with others who shared similar experiences, helped shape legislation that established clearer limits on HOA authority and strengthened homeowner rights. The bill passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law the following year. 4 years after the incident, my property had completely transformed. My fruit trees were now established, producing abundant harvests. I had installed a small greenhouse where I started seedlings for the community garden each spring. My yard had become something of a showcase for how to create a beautiful, productive landscape while remaining within HOA guidelines. Oakridge Estates had transformed as well. Under Walter's leadership, the HOA had evolved into a true community organization focused on enhancing the neighborhood rather than just enforcing rules. Property values had risen significantly, apparently. Potential buyers were attracted to an HOA with a reputation for being reasonable and community-oriented. One day, as I was harvesting peaches from one of my newer trees, a young couple stopped by. They introduced themselves as prospective buyers looking at a house down the street. "We've heard great things about this HOA," the woman said. "Apparently, it's not like typical HOAs that are always hassling homeowners." "That's right," I confirmed. "Our HOA is focused on community building and reasonable governance. It wasn't always that way, though." I gave them a brief version of what had happened with my cherry trees and the changes that followed. They listened with widening eyes. "So you're basically responsible for transforming the whole community," the man said admiringly. I shook my head. "I just stood up for what was right. The transformation happened because enough people wanted change and worked together to make it happen." As they left, carrying a bag of fresh peaches I had insisted they take, I reflected on how far we had come. My $40,000 lawsuit had been about more than money or even justice for my lost trees. It had been a catalyst for change in our community, in Patricia's life, and in HOA practices beyond our neighborhood. 5 years to the day after Patricia had my cherry trees cut down, I hosted a neighborhood gathering in my backyard. It had become an annual tradition, a celebration of community and growth. Children played on the lawn, neighbors chatted in small groups, and everyone enjoyed food made with fruits and vegetables from our community garden and personal yards. Walter, now in his final term as HOA president before retirement, raised a glass in a toast. To Ryan, whose stand against injustice helped us create the community we have today, and to growth not just of fruit trees but of understanding and respect. As everyone applauded, I looked around at the neighbors who had become friends, at the flourishing garden I had created, and at the young cherry trees in the distance that would someday grow as tall and fruitful as the ones I had lost. Sometimes, The things we lose make way for new growth we never could have imagined. My $40,000 lawsuit had been about destroyed trees, but what grew in their place, a transformed community, new friendships and positive legal changes, was worth far more than any monetary settlement. I raised my own glass in response to standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and to all of you who proved that a true community is built on mutual respect, not just rules and regulations. As the sun set over Oakridge Estates, casting a golden glow over the gathering, I knew that the painful experience of losing my cherry trees had ultimately yielded the sweetest fruit of all positive change that would continue to grow and flourish for years to come. From time to time, I still receive emails and calls from homeowners facing similar situations with their HOAs. I always make time to listen and offer what guidance I can, passing along the lessons I learned through my own experience. Some have successfully challenged unreasonable rules or actions. Others have worked within their systems to elect new board members and change their HOA culture from within. Each success story reminds me that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, creates ripples that extend far beyond our individual circumstances. My $40,000 lawsuit over fruit trees had started as a personal fight for justice, but had grown into something much more significant, a catalyst for positive change in communities across the state. The young fruit trees in my yard continue to grow stronger each year, their roots extending deep into the soil, their branches reaching toward the sky. Much like the community around them, they are thriving proof that new beginnings often follow endings, and that growth, sometimes painful, always transformative, is the natural order of things.